Let's continue the discussion on the environmental Kuznets curve. The original studies all use cross sections. That is, they compared countries with different levels of income as to their pressure on the environment. As more data have become available, we can also look at the environmental Kuznets curve over time. And here's an example for carbon dioxide emissions in the United States. If you focus on CO2 emissions per capita, in red, then there is no environmental Kuznets curve inside. The curve flattens, but it does not turn down. Of course, the population of the United States has kept growing, so total CO2 emissions keep growing as well. However, if you focus on the CO2 intensity, that is CO2 emissions per dollar value added, you do see an environmental Kuznets curve. That is, pressure on the environment first goes up, but as US hits a per capita income of around $5,000 per person per year on average, from that point onwards, CO2 intensity has fallen. And the reason for that is in this graph here. From around 1920 onwards, the increase in the demand for energy has been met by oil rather than coal. And from 1945 onwards, there's been a lot of gas, natural gas as well. And that explains why CO2 emissions have not risen. Now, some people interpret the environmental Kuznets curve as follows. If we just grow our economy, if we just grow rich, the environment will clean up itself. And we don't need to do anything. And that, of course, assumes that the environmental Kuznets curve is real and can be found in every environmental problem, which is not the case. But suspending our disbelief for a moment and assuming that there is an environmental Kuznets curve, this is the wrong interpretation. It is not the case that if we grow rich, if our economies grow, then environmental pressure will automatically drop. And the reason for that is that the environmental Kuznets curve in econometric terms is an association. It is not a causal relationship. It's not that because we grow rich and pressure on the environment falls. It has to do with things that are associated with being rich rather than being rich itself. That just follows from the econometrics. There's no suggestion of a causal relationship, but it's perhaps best illustrated with an example of how it was a policy intervention that changed the relationship. And let's just have a look at cycling. That's the example I'm going to use. Now, what you're looking at here is the density of cycle paths in Western Europe. In the UK, there's a few. In France, there's not so many. Spain, Italy, hardly any. And then if you look at the western part of Germany, all over Germany and particularly the Netherlands, you see that there's just cycle paths everywhere. And these are countries that have comparable incomes and comparable institutions and those sort of things. So it's not just wealth that determines cycling. Well, that's the first thing. But why is the Netherlands as it is in terms of cycling? Let's look at history for a bit. Here are two series of pictures from Amsterdam. This is Van der Helstraat, the eerste Van der Helstraat, and this is the Houstraat. And this is how it used to be. Streets that were essentially for pedestrians and cyclists. And then there's a middle period. This is the 1960s when there's cars everywhere. And this is Amsterdam as you know it now. Very friendly to cyclists, very friendly to pedestrians. So there is an environmental Kuznets curve here. You sort of like start poor with very few cars. Then you grow rich. And there's lots of cars, then you grow richer still, and there's very few cars, and pressure on the environment is falling again. This is a classic example of the environmental Kuznets curve. But this did not happen because people in the Netherlands grew richer. What happened was, well, in the 60s, in the early 70s. This is what Amsterdam and other cities in the Netherlands and actually cities across the world look like. They're just completely given over to cars. But other things happened as well. What you're looking at here is the annual number of traffic fatalities. Low in the 50s, then it started rising, and then there's a turning point in the 1970s. This is traffic victims by mode, and in light green we're looking at the pedestrians, and in dark green we're looking at the cyclists, and these are people driving mopeds. And you see there's an increase as well as a drop. Now this is the picture of traffic fatalities by mode. Here is the same thing by age. And what you see is that the number of children, the under 20s, fatalities increased as well from the 1950s to the 1970s. And around that time, a lot of people got worried about the safety of their children on the road because of the number of cars that were there. People under 18 are not allowed to drive, so they had no alternative but to cycle. And they simply thought that the number of cars on the road made traffic dangerous to their children. And a lot of people were concerned about that. And then the child of a particularly influential journalist got killed, and he started this campaign, Stop the Child Murder. And that is what it was called, child murder. No euphemisms there. And that led to widespread protests. Here are more pictures of Amsterdam, where people were just blocking the streets by putting the bikes there. Confrontations with drivers that almost turned violent, and in a few cases did turn violent, and blockades of streets and everything. This was a very bottom-up type of, very grassroots type of movement. People were simply fed up with all the cars in the road and the unsafe situation, not being able to cycle, not being able to let your children travel to school safely, not being able to let your children play on the streets anymore. And that led to a lot of pressure on the local governments to provide the infrastructure. And that is the situation that we see now, that because of this political pressure on particularly local politicians, the Netherlands started providing safe infrastructure. And that is the picture that we have of the Netherlands now, that the country that is very safe to cycle. And because it's very safe to cycle, a lot of people do cycle. But the important takeaway message here is that this did not happen because people grew rich. It happened because people did not accept the situation and use their voice to change it. And that is the important take-home lesson from the policy implications on the environmental Kuznets curve. These things don't happen by themselves. They require action. Environmental cleanup requires